It was a time like no other. Humanity had always believed that their home, Earth, was the safest place in the universe. The planet thrived. Its people focused on innovation, art, and the simple joys of life. They had reached the stars, sending explorers to the far corners of space. But Earth remained untouched, an oasis of peace amidst the vast chaos of the universe. But all that was about to change. The first sign of danger came in the form of a strange signal, a series of cryptic messages sent from deep space. At first, the scientists and researchers believed it was just an anomaly. Perhaps it was a glitch in one of the many satellites orbiting Earth. But then, the signal began to repeat, each transmission more urgent than the last. The message was clear: we are coming. Nobody knew who they were. Nobody knew what kind of threat lay beyond the stars. But one thing was certain: humanity was not prepared. At first, governments dismissed the warnings. They chalked it up to being a random message from some far-off alien race, nothing to worry about. But the message kept coming, and soon, strange things began happening in the skies. UFO sightings became more frequent. Aircraft disappeared without a trace, and strange objects were spotted in the atmosphere. The entire world held its breath as the message continued: we are coming. Prepare yourselves. In just a matter of weeks, the world began to realize something was terribly wrong. What had started as mysterious signals from the stars had escalated into something far more dangerous: an invasion. The first wave of alien ships arrived without warning. They were massive, larger than anything humanity had ever seen. Thousands of ships filled the sky, their dark silhouettes blotting out the sun. People on Earth watched in horror as the invaders began to descend. These were no peaceful visitors. No, these were warships, and they were not interested in peace. The invaders, known as the Caliphs, had come with one purpose: to destroy humanity and take Earth for themselves. The Caliphs were a race of ruthless conquerors, with advanced technology far beyond anything humanity had ever imagined. They had traveled across the galaxy, conquering planet after planet, wiping out civilizations that stood in their way. And now, they had set their sights on Earth. The first attack was devastating. Major cities around the world were hit with precision strikes, reducing towering skyscrapers to rubble in an instant. There was no time to prepare. Humanity had no defense against the overwhelming power of the Caliph fleet. The Earth's military forces scrambled to mount a counterattack, but their weapons were useless. The Caliph ships had shields that rendered human weaponry completely ineffective. As the first wave of destruction rained down on Earth, people everywhere watched in disbelief. The attacks were swift, efficient, and merciless. No one was spared. The Caliphs showed no compassion, no mercy. Entire populations were wiped out in a matter of hours, and humanity's once thriving cities were left in ruins. In the chaos that followed, the world united in fear. The news reports were filled with terrifying images of the Caliph invasion. Governments declared martial law, and people scrambled for safety. For the first time in history, humanity found itself fighting for its very survival. But even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity refused to give up. In the rubble of destroyed cities, survivors began to band together, determined to fight back. There were whispers of hope. Humanity had been through wars before, and they had always found a way to survive. But this was different. The Caliphs were unlike anything Earth had ever seen. In one small corner of the world, a group of scientists and military leaders gathered. They had one goal: to understand the invaders and find a way to stop them. They worked tirelessly, poring over any piece of technology they could capture from the Caliph's wreckage. It was their only hope. But even as they worked, the Caliphs showed no signs of relenting. The enemy was relentless, and every attempt to strike back had failed miserably. Desperation set in as humanity realized that they were outmatched, outgunned, and outclassed. The Caliphs had attacked with such force that it seemed there was no way to fight back. But as the weeks went by, something began to change. The humans, who were being crushed under the weight of the alien assault, began to realize that there was one thing the Caliphs had underestimated: humanity's will to survive. In the face of extinction, humans refused to be defeated. They might not have had the advanced technology the Caliphs possessed, but they had something far more powerful: the drive to keep fighting, no matter the odds. And that spark of hope, though small, would soon grow into something much more dangerous. The Caliphs had made one critical mistake. They thought humanity was weak, easily broken. They assumed that humans would bow down to their superior power. But in their arrogance, the Caliphs had failed to understand the true strength of the human spirit. And that was a mistake they would soon come to regret. As the first wave of destruction faded, humanity began to regroup. Small pockets of resistance formed all over the world. They weren't soldiers. They were ordinary people who had seen their homes destroyed, their loved ones taken, and their cities turned to dust. And they were furious. They would not go down without a fight. The Caliphs may have started the war, but humanity would finish it. The world's fate was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: the beginning of the end had just begun. The Caliphs' invasion had turned the world upside down. What was once a thriving and peaceful planet was now a war-torn wasteland. Major cities were reduced to rubble, entire populations wiped out in a matter of hours. The Caliphs were methodical, efficient, and relentless, but for all their power, they underestimated one crucial thing about humanity: the will to survive. After the initial shock of the invasion, humanity began to regroup. People from all walks of life, soldiers, scientists, engineers, and even civilians, banded together. They formed small pockets of resistance, hidden away in the crumbling remains of the cities, in underground bunkers, and in the wilderness. The world had been thrown into chaos, but the survivors refused to give up. Across the globe, a new sense of unity emerged. The differences that had once divided nations, ideologies, and cultures were now irrelevant. Earth's citizens had only one goal: survival. Governments that had once fought among themselves now put their resources together. Military forces that had been overwhelmed by the Caliph's technology now began to strategize. And in the shadows, scientists worked tirelessly to decode the alien technology they had scavenged from the wreckage. The Caliph's technology was advanced, yes, but humanity had always been resourceful. If there was one thing humans had learned through centuries of struggle, it was that when pushed to the edge, they would rise to the occasion. They would adapt. They would fight. One group, led by a brilliant young scientist named Dr. Aiden Carter, was tasked with reverse engineering the Caliph technology. Aiden was no stranger to adversity. He had grown up in a poor, war-torn region of Earth and had seen firsthand the resilience of the human spirit. But even he couldn't believe how quickly humanity was learning to fight back. Dr. Carter's team had managed to salvage several pieces of alien weaponry, and after weeks of experimentation, they discovered something shocking. The Caliph's ships had a single glaring weakness: their shields, impenetrable to all conventional weaponry, could be bypassed with a special frequency, one that could be emitted by Earth's own satellites. But there was a catch. The frequency could only be sustained for a few seconds before it would fry the satellite circuits. In other words, it was a one-time shot. Aiden's team worked around the clock, perfecting the system. They knew the stakes were higher than ever. If they failed, humanity would be doomed. But the hope that they could fight back kept them going, day after day. Meanwhile, in the streets, the people were not idle. The survivors were organizing. In cities, resistance groups formed, pooling their resources to fight back against the Caliphs. They used guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strategies that relied on stealth and speed. It wasn't much against the invaders' overwhelming firepower, but it was all they had. These human forces were far from organized armies. They were just ordinary people, farmers, teachers, doctors, and factory workers who had been thrust into the fight for survival. But they were resourceful, and they were angry. They were angry because they had been betrayed, angry because they had watched everything they loved crumble under the weight of an alien empire. And this anger became their greatest strength. One of the most surprising aspects of the resistance was the widespread use of Earth's ancient weapons, swords, spears, and homemade explosives. The Caliphs may have had technology beyond humanity's wildest dreams, but they had never expected humans to fight like this. There was no honor in war, no rules, no pity. Humanity wasn't bound by the conventions of war. They had nothing to lose. Back in the war rooms, military leaders, many of whom had lost family and comrades in the initial attacks, were starting to piece together a plan. They understood that the Caliphs were powerful, but they also understood that the invaders were arrogant. The Caliphs had not expected such fierce resistance, and that gave humanity an advantage. Over time, the Caliphs began to make mistakes. They underestimated the determination of Earth's people. They didn't account for the fact that humans would fight with everything they had, no matter how impossible the odds. It became clear that the Caliphs' initial assumptions, that they could simply annihilate humanity and take the planet, were wrong. The Caliphs' pride was their undoing. As the resistance grew stronger, the people of Earth were beginning to strike back. With each victory, no matter how small, the humans gained confidence. They began to feel that they were not as helpless as they once thought. Earth was still their home, and they would do anything to defend it. The Caliphs, on the other hand, grew more frustrated. Their seemingly unbeatable strategy had faltered. The humans were not crumbling under the weight of their attacks. In fact, they were doing the unthinkable. They were fighting back. Dr. Aiden Carter's plan was ready. The signal frequency was locked in, and humanity's final weapon was in place. The next few hours would determine the fate of the world. The world held its breath. Would the human resistance succeed, or would this be the end of Earth's story? The last stand was about to begin, and humanity's fate hung in the balance. The hours dragged on like a never-ending nightmare. As humanity prepared for what would be their most dangerous mission yet, the world held its collective breath. The resistance had assembled in secret locations, huddled together in underground bunkers, abandoned cities, and hidden fortresses. The Caliphs' forces were scattered across Earth, holding key positions in every major city, but their arrogance had left them vulnerable. They still believed that the war was all but won, but Earth's forces were ready to prove them wrong. Dr. Aiden Carter's team had worked tirelessly for days on end to perfect the frequency that would take down the Caliph shields. Their only hope now was to act quickly and strike at the heart of the alien invaders while they were still distracted by their victory. The clock was ticking, and there was no room for error. As dawn broke over the ruined landscape, the first signs of the resistance's movement were detected. Using guerrilla tactics, humanity's forces began to infiltrate Caliph-controlled zones. They attacked supply lines, sabotaged communication towers, and laid explosive traps wherever they could. The Caliphs, initially confident in their superiority, were now on edge. They could no longer ignore the growing resistance. In the command centers, the Caliph commanders were starting to question their initial strategy. Reports came in of widespread sabotage, and their once iron grip on Earth seemed to be slipping. But it wasn't until the first signs of the human weaponry that they truly understood how much danger they were in. As the resistance forces moved forward, the Caliphs were forced to acknowledge a chilling reality. Humans weren't simply fighting to survive. They were fighting for their very existence. And for all their technological superiority, the Caliphs had underestimated just how far the human spirit could push. Back in the underground laboratories, Dr. Aiden Carter's team activated the satellite network. The signal was sent, its frequency piercing through the atmosphere, aimed directly at the Caliph fleet in orbit. The moment the frequency hit their ships, the results were immediate. The Caliph's once impenetrable shields flickered and then collapsed. The alien ships were exposed, vulnerable for the first time since the invasion began. The resistance had managed to exploit the one weakness the Caliphs had never anticipated. But there was no time to celebrate. The Caloths, realizing their shields had been compromised, immediately launched a counterattack. Massive reinforcements poured down from their ships, and the battle began in earnest. The sky lit up with flashes of energy, the earth itself shaking as explosions rocked the surface. The Caloths' forces had advanced weaponry and technology beyond anything humans had ever seen, but now the playing field was level. The humans were no longer outmatched. They were in the fight of their lives. But even with the advantage of disabling the shields, the Caloths had far superior numbers. Their warriors, who were genetically engineered for war, stormed Earth's cities with ruthless efficiency. The resistance, though smaller, fought with everything they had. They fought for their homes, their families, and their future. In the heart of the battlefield, a young soldier named Alina Moore led a small group of resistance fighters to infiltrate a Caloth stronghold. She had seen the devastation firsthand. Her city was in ruins, her family gone. There was nothing left to lose. As she crept through the shadows, she felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. One wrong move, and it was over. The group reached the main entrance of the Caloth stronghold. The Caloth forces had set up a heavy defense, but Alina's team had a secret weapon. The homemade explosives they had developed, a product of human ingenuity and desperation, were powerful enough to breach the stronghold's defenses. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a fighting chance. With a deep breath, Alina gave the signal. The resistance fighters stormed the gates, throwing explosives into the heart of the stronghold. The explosion was deafening, sending shockwaves through the walls. The Caloths were caught off guard, scrambling to respond as the humans fought their way deeper into the facility. Inside, they found what they were looking for: the Caloths' main command center, the nerve center of the invasion. This was the place where they had been orchestrating the destruction of Earth, and now it was their turn to fall. Alina's team pushed forward, taking out Caloth soldiers one by one. Each shot a step closer to victory. They knew that the success of this mission would be crucial to turning the tide of the war. But even as they fought, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more at play here. The Caloths were ruthless, yes, but they weren't stupid. They were holding something back. In the midst of the chaos, Alina found something that sent a chill down her spine: a hidden chamber, filled with strange alien artifacts. Among them was a device, unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was massive, humming with an eerie energy. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it wasn't good. Before she could investigate further, an explosion rocked the building, sending her and her team flying to the ground. The device had been triggered, and the entire stronghold was about to collapse. As the team scrambled to escape, Alina's mind raced. What had they just discovered? What was the Caloths' true plan? She couldn't help but feel that they were walking into a trap. As they made their way out, the resistance fighters looked up at the sky. They could see the Caloth ships in orbit, preparing for their next strike. The battle was far from over. Humanity had gained ground, but the war was only just beginning. The tipping point had arrived. The fate of Earth would be decided in the coming days, and the humans had no intention of going down without a fight. They had survived the first wave of the invasion, and now they were going to make sure the Caloths never saw the end of this war. The story was far from over, and the humans were just getting started. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the remnants of the Caloth stronghold crumbled. Alina and her team had barely escaped with their lives, but they carried with them more than just memories of the battle. They had uncovered a terrifying secret, one that could change the course of the war, and possibly the fate of humanity itself. As they made their way back to the resistance base, Alina's mind raced. What was the device? Why was it hidden away in such a secure place? She couldn't shake the feeling that the Caloths weren't just trying to conquer Earth. They had another, far more insidious plan in motion. She shared her suspicions with the team, but they had no answers. They needed more information, and fast. Back at the base, the resistance was still reeling from the loss of several key cities to Caloth forces. The war was far from over. The Caliphs had the advantage in numbers, and their technology was far superior to anything humanity had developed. But they had underestimated one thing: the sheer will of humanity to survive. Dr. Aiden Carter and his team were already hard at work analyzing the device Alina had found. The lab was filled with the whir of machines and the clattering of keyboards as the team of scientists pored over data and schematics. The device was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It was a hybrid of alien technology, far more advanced than the Caliph's weapons and shields. But it was incomplete. It seemed like a weapon of mass destruction, but it was still in the prototype phase. "What do you think it's for?" Alina asked, her voice tinged with concern. Dr. Carter adjusted his glasses and looked up. "We're still trying to figure that out, but we believe it's some sort of biological weapon. A virus, perhaps. Something that could wipe out all of humanity in one fell swoop. The Caliphs have used similar methods in the past, eradicating entire populations of species they've conquered. But this is something else. It's much more refined." Alina's blood ran cold. "You mean they were planning to wipe us out completely?" Dr. Carter nodded gravely. "That's what we think. If they were successful, they could have turned Earth into their own personal breeding ground, wiping us out and replacing us with their own soldiers or slaves." The implications were horrifying. Humanity had been fighting for survival, not knowing that the real battle wasn't just for Earth, it was for their very existence. The Caliphs weren't interested in ruling Earth. They were looking to destroy it, to eradicate humanity completely. Alina couldn't believe it. All this time, the war hadn't been about conquest, it had been about extermination. And now, the resistance was up against not just an invading force, but a force determined to wipe them from the face of the galaxy. But something else nagged at Alina's mind. If the Caliphs had this devastating weapon, why hadn't they used it yet? Why were they still fighting in the traditional sense, sending armies to attack and invade? Why had they waited? As these questions swirled in her head, an urgent message came through on the Resistance's secure communication network. It was a call for reinforcements. The Caliphs were preparing for a final assault, one that would either break the Resistance for good or send the aliens running back to the stars in defeat. The battle would take place in the heart of the Caliphs' occupied territory, the very place where their command center was located. "We don't have much time," Alina said, her voice firm. "We need to get this information to the front lines. The Resistance is counting on us." The decision was made. The team would push forward, armed with the knowledge of the Caliphs' true intentions and the new weapon they had discovered. It was humanity's last chance to strike back. As Alina and her team prepared for the next phase of the mission, they couldn't help but feel the weight of their responsibility. If they failed, it would mean the end of everything. The war had already cost so much: lives, cities, hope. But it wasn't over yet. Humanity had one last chance to turn the tide in their favor. But the Caliphs weren't going to let them off that easily. As the Resistance fighters loaded into their ships and prepared for their mission, the skies above Earth darkened. The Caliph's massive fleet had been spotted, descending from orbit, and they weren't alone. Something else was coming, something far worse than they had imagined. Alina's stomach tightened as she watched the horizon. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The reckoning is here." The time for hiding and waiting was over. Humanity was going to have to make their final stand. They had been pushed to the edge, but they weren't backing down. If the Caliphs wanted to eradicate them, they would have to do it the hard way. Humanity wasn't going to go down without a fight. The stakes had never been higher. The battle for Earth was about to begin. And this time, humanity would fight not just for survival, but for the right to exist. And no one, not even the Caliphs, could predict what would happen next. The sky above the Resistance base was filled with the roar of engines as the ships loaded with brave men and women prepared to leave. Their destination, the heart of the Caliph's stronghold, the very place where the Caliph forces had been planning their final devastating strike against humanity. It was the last stronghold, the last place they could strike, and humanity's final hope. Elena stood on the edge of the command center, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of what was to come felt heavier than anything she had ever carried before. The enemy, with their overwhelming technology and seemingly endless numbers, had made it clear that they would stop at nothing to wipe humanity from existence. The battle would be brutal, and they all knew it. But what drove her forward wasn't fear. It was the knowledge that if they failed, there would be nothing left of the world they loved. Behind her, Dr. Carter and his team worked furiously, finalizing the plans to disable the Caliph weapon. It was humanity's only hope. Without that weapon, they stood a fighting chance. If they could destroy it, the Caliphs would be vulnerable, and they could end the war on their own terms. "I've been over the plans, Elena," Dr. Carter said, his voice crackling with urgency. "This is our best shot. If we can get in and destroy that device, we'll cripple the Caliph's operations here. But you need to move fast. The longer you take, the more reinforcements they'll send. It's now or never." Elena nodded, her resolve hardening. She was the leader of this mission, the one who would lead humanity's final stand. Every decision she made from this point on would affect the fate of everyone in this war. There was no turning back. "We're ready," Elena said, turning to the rest of her team. "Everyone's geared up and set to go. It's all or nothing now. We've trained for this, and we've made it this far. Now it's time to show the Caliphs what humanity is capable of." The team, clad in their battle gear, stood in formation, a sea of determination in their eyes. The soldiers knew the risks. They knew the danger, but they also knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything they held dear. The Earth, their families, their homes, their future. As the ships ascended into the darkening sky, the tension in the air was palpable. The crew remained silent, each person lost in their thoughts, the weight of the mission pressing heavily on them. The resistance forces had gathered for this moment, the final showdown. The fleet of ships that had been built from the remnants of humanity's scattered forces now surged forward with one goal: to strike the heart of the Caliph Empire and end this war once and for all. Elena sat in the cockpit of her ship, staring out the viewport at the vast expanse of stars stretching before her. In the distance, the Caliph stronghold loomed like a dark, ominous shadow, its towering structures filled with thousands of enemy troops. It was a fortress, a city built on conquest and destruction. But what the Caliphs didn't know was that they had underestimated the one thing that had kept humanity alive: resilience. They hadn't just been fighting for survival, they had been fighting for revenge. As they neared the Caliph stronghold, the calm before the storm was broken by a blaring alarm. The ships had reached the outer perimeter of the enemy defenses. The Caliphs were prepared for the final assault, their advanced technology ready to crush any attempt at resistance. Elena's grip tightened on the controls. This was the moment. "Brace for impact." The commander's voice came through the communication system. The resistance fleet surged forward, and the sky lit up with the brilliance of weapons fire. The battle had begun. Missiles screamed past, exploding in clouds of fire and smoke, while the ships of humanity weaved through enemy fire, skillfully dodging the Caliph's brutal counterattacks. It was chaos. Absolute chaos. But amid the mayhem, Elena's mind remained focused. She had a mission to complete, and she would see it through. The Caliph fleet was formidable, their ships unlike anything humanity had ever seen before. They were massive, with sleek, jagged designs that seemed to cut through space like knives. But humanity had one thing the Caliphs didn't: the will to fight for what was theirs. The Caliphs had underestimated humanity's power, and now they were going to learn what happens when you push people too far. As the battle raged on in the skies above, Elena and her team made their way toward the heart of the Caliph stronghold. The resistance had learned from their past mistakes. They knew the Caliph's weaknesses, and they were going to exploit them. The team moved quickly, carefully avoiding enemy patrols and securing vital locations. The closer they got to their objective, the more the stakes grew. The Caliths weren't just fighting back with brute force. They were using every trick in their arsenal to prevent the mission from succeeding. But Alina wasn't about to let them win. The people of Earth had been pushed to the edge, but now it was time for them to fight back with everything they had. "This is it," Alina said, looking around at her team. "We're almost there. We take down their weapon. And we win this war. We end it once and for all." The team nodded, knowing that they had no choice but to succeed. It wasn't just about winning the war. It was about making sure the Caliths never threatened humanity again. As they approached the heart of the enemy stronghold, the air grew thick with tension. The Caliths were about to realize just how wrong they were to underestimate the resilience of humankind. The final push had begun, and there was no turning back now. The ground beneath Alina's boots trembled as she and her team advanced through the labyrinth of steel corridors within the heart of the Calith stronghold. Every step they took echoed through the halls, but there was no turning back now. Their mission was clear, and the cost of failure was unimaginable. "Stay alert," Alina whispered into her comms, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "We're getting close." The corridors, once pristine and cold, were now filled with the remnants of the Calith force's last stand. The walls were scarred with blaster fire, and the flickering lights overhead cast eerie shadows. Alina could hear the distant hum of the Calith's war machines. Every inch of this place screamed danger, but she couldn't afford fear. Not now. "We're almost at the central core," Dr. Carter's voice crackled over the comm. "Once you reach the control room, you'll need to shut down the defense systems before we can initiate the override sequence. It's going to be tight." "I know," Alina replied. She glanced at the team, each one of them moving with military precision, their faces set with determination. These were the finest soldiers humanity had to offer, and their mission was more than just personal. This was a fight for the survival of their species. The hum of the Calith war machines grew louder, and Alina's grip tightened around her weapon. They had known the risks, but now, standing in the enemy's home base, facing their enemies head-on, the magnitude of what they were about to do was overwhelming. But the alternative, allowing the Caliths to continue their path of destruction, was worse than anything they could face here. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The team immediately dropped into a defensive crouch, weapons raised. Alina motioned for everyone to stay silent as the footsteps grew louder. The enemy was approaching. They had to move quickly. A Calith soldier appeared at the corner, walking down the hall, unaware of the team's presence. Alina raised her hand, signaling for the team to hold their fire. She watched the alien approach, its sleek, insectoid features glowing faintly in the dim light. The Caliths had always relied on their technology and overwhelming numbers, but in their arrogance, they had overlooked one thing: the unpredictability and ingenuity of humans. As the soldier walked past them, Alina made a snap decision. She signaled for her team to move forward, and with a series of swift and silent movements, they advanced through the hallways. Every step was calculated, every movement designed to avoid detection. The Caliths had no idea they were being hunted in their own home. Finally, they reached the control room. It was a massive chamber, its walls lined with high-tech panels and glowing interfaces. In the center of the room stood the control unit, the heart of the Calith defense systems. This was the key to disabling the Calith's weapons, but the system was heavily guarded. Alina nodded at her team. "We need to take out those guards fast. No mistakes." The team quickly formed up, moving with synchronized precision. They stormed the control room, catching the Calith guards off guard. The air was thick with tension as the team fought their way through, the sounds of blaster fire and alien screeches filling the room. But Alina's focus never wavered. She moved like a force of nature, her eyes locked on the control unit. "Go. Now," she shouted, signaling for her team to take out the last of the guards. The final wave of Caliths fell under their fire, and the room fell silent except for the faint hum of the control systems. Elena sprinted to the main console. "Dr. Carter, we're in position. You're up." "Shutting down the defense grid now," Dr. Carter replied. The tension in his voice was palpable as he worked to bypass the Caliph security protocols. The team held their breath as the countdown began. Seconds felt like hours as the Caliph security systems flashed red and then suddenly went dark. The defense systems had been shut down. For the first time since humanity had entered this war, the Caliphs were vulnerable. "We've got a window. Move out," Elena ordered. She and her team wasted no time, sprinting towards the exit, adrenaline coursing through their bodies. They were not done yet. There was one final objective left. They had to disable the Caliph's primary weapon, the one that had been aimed at Earth for years. As they made their way through the now quiet hallways, Elena's mind raced. They had taken down the defense systems, but the real battle was still ahead. The Caliphs would not go down without a fight. She knew they would regroup, and soon the stronghold would be flooded with reinforcements. But she also knew one thing. This was humanity's moment. They had faced extinction and survived. They had fought for every inch of their planet's survival. And now, they were going to finish this fight. When they reached the weapon chamber, Elena's heart skipped a beat. The massive device stood before them, pulsating with an eerie glow. The Caliphs had planned to use this weapon to obliterate the remaining resistance forces and wipe out humanity once and for all. But now, it was their greatest weakness. "We've got one shot at this," Elena said, looking around at her team. "If we fail here, there is no going back." She placed a hand on the console and, with a deep breath, began the sequence to disable the weapon. As the countdown began, Elena heard the Caliph reinforcements closing in. Time was running out, but they had come this far. This was it, the final test of their resolve. They had come to this place with one goal: to prove that humanity could never be erased. And now, they would finish what they had started. The countdown to the destruction of the Caliph weapon was ticking, each second drawing them closer to either victory or certain death. Elena's fingers flew across the console, working at lightning speed to initiate the system override. The sound of approaching Caliph soldiers echoed through the metal walls of the stronghold, sending an icy chill through her body. There was no time left. "Almost there," Elena muttered, sweat trickling down her forehead. The massive weapon before her hummed with power, but she knew one wrong move, one misstep, and all of humanity's hopes would be dashed. "We've got incoming," shouted one of her team members, Sergeant Miles. "Get ready." The Caliph soldiers were closing in, and the sounds of their high-tech weapons reverberated in the hallways. Elena glanced at the digital timer on the console. 30 seconds. She had to complete the override now, or everything would be for nothing. With one last push of the button, the countdown on the Caliph weapon abruptly stopped. A triumphant beep echoed through the room as the weapon's power shut down. The lights that had once pulsed ominously now went dim. The Caliph's greatest weapon was no longer a threat. "Yes," Elena exhaled sharply, feeling a wave of relief rush over her, but it was short-lived. The Caliph forces would be on them in mere moments. "Move," Elena shouted as she grabbed her weapon and dashed toward the exit. "We need to get out of here now." The team sprang into action, following Elena's lead as they sprinted through the corridors. Behind them, the sounds of the Caliph army surged forward, their heavy boots pounding the metal floors like thunder. The Caliphs were furious. They had underestimated humanity's resolve and ingenuity, and now they would pay the price. Despite their superior technology, the Caliph forces had never encountered an adversary like the humans. As Elena and her team fought their way through the remaining opposition, it was clear. The Caliphs had failed to crush humanity, and now they were paying the price for their hubris. Explosions rocked the corridors as the Caliph stronghold shook from the blast of their own weaponry backfiring. Elena knew their time was limited. The Caliph base was collapsing, and they needed to escape before the whole structure came down on top of them. As they neared the exit, The ground trembled once more. Elena barely managed to keep her balance as the building groaned under the stress of the damage they had caused. The Caliths were not going to let them go without a fight. A group of Calith soldiers appeared in front of them, weapons raised, but Elena's team was ready. They didn't hesitate. In the next few moments, the sounds of battle filled the air. Elena's team fired with deadly precision, clearing their path. They were unstoppable. These soldiers were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting to protect everything humanity had built. They were fighting for the future. Get to the exit. Elena shouted again, urging her team forward. She was the last one to turn and take one final look at the Calith stronghold before they reached the doors. The walls were cracked, and the very structure of the facility seemed to groan in protest, unable to withstand the damage that had been done. The final push came with a rush of urgency. The team sprinted toward the escape pod, a small ship they'd brought with them to make their getaway. The countdown was ticking. If they didn't leave now, they would be trapped. "We're almost there," Sergeant Miles yelled as the escape pod doors began to close. But just as the doors slid shut, a massive explosion erupted behind them, sending a shockwave through the ground. The escape pod's thrusters roared to life, and with a final deafening blast, they were shot into the sky, leaving the Calith stronghold behind them. As the pod soared through space, Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The relief was overwhelming, but there was no time to celebrate. The war was far from over. There would be more Caliths to face, more battles to fight, but for the first time in years, humanity had a victory to claim. "We did it," Elena whispered to herself, her voice filled with awe. "We really did it." The Calith Empire, once proud and unchallenged, had now been struck a mortal blow. Humanity had stood up to the alien invaders and proved they were not to be underestimated. They had fought back, and now the universe would know the truth. Humanity was not just a species to be erased. They were a force to be reckoned with. As the escape pod glided toward Earth, Elena and her team knew their work was far from finished. The Caliths might be on the brink of collapse, but there would be other threats. Humanity would have to remain vigilant. But for now, they could savor this victory. The universe had learned a powerful lesson: never underestimate humanity. And for the first time, the power was in their hands. The war had ended, but the story of humanity's rise had just begun.